Okay, hello everyone. I will discuss to you in this video lecture analytic tradition, logic, and critical thinking as method of philosophizing. Now, logic, unlike other methods of philosophizing, use knowledge in describing truth. Diba? Si phenomenology, it uses person's consciousness, existentialism, personal choices and freedom. Si postmodernism, it believed that truth is not absolute. That means we need we just we need to consider not just rational elements but also non-rational elements of nature. But the logic, analytic tradition, it uses language and it uses rational thinking in arriving truth. Now the question is, can language objectively describe truth? For the philosophers of this tradition, language cannot objectively describe truth. For Ludwig Wittgenstein, an analytic philosopher, language is socially conditioned. We understand the world solely in terms of our language games, that is, our linguistic social contracts. Truth as we perceive it is itself socially constructed. Now, analytic philosophy is the conviction that to some degree philosophical problems, puzzles, and errors are rooted in language and can be solved or avoided by a sound understanding of language and careful attention to its workings. So ito, si analytic philosophy, this is a method of philosophy that believe that or is the conviction that to some significant degree philosophical problems, puzzles, and errors are rooted in language. So, si analytic philosophy believe that philosophical problems, errors, puzzles, nag-start sa language itself and can be resolved or can be avoided by sound understanding of the language and careful attention to its working. So, ang problema, di ba? Philosophical problems, philosophical questions, errors started in language itself. And it can be solved or it can be avoided by sound understanding of the language and careful attention to its working. That is for analytic philosophy, logic. Problema, nag-start sa language. It can be solved or avoided also through understanding the language itself. Analysis refers to a method owing a great deal to the pioneers. So we have pioneers of analytic philosophy, Bernard Russell, G.E. Moore, Ludwig Wittgenstein, and then J.L. Austin. So they are the pioneers of analytic philosophy. Critics are up to this point, up to point this concern. They might say this fixation language and logic as one aspect of the trivialization of philosophy, with which they charge the analytic movement. In any case, the last 2 to 3 decades have seen, on the one hand, increased self-searching as to analytic approach and more efforts to apply it to such. Now, as part of the analytic philosophy, we will discuss logic and critical thinking as tools in reasoning. Okay, logic. Logic is centered on the analysis and construction of arguments. So, nakasenter si logic sa how to analyzing or constructing of arguments. Diba? In the first chapter, logic is discussed as one of the main branches of philosophy. Now, in this part, we will discuss logic as method of philosophizing which centers on analyzing argument and constructing argument. So that is logic. You can understand, you can know the truth of a particular argument, whether such argument is truth, valid, or invalid, by analyzing it or through knowing how it is constructed. Logic and critical thinking serve as paths to freedom from half-truths and deceptions. Diba? They may serve as tools in determining um, uh, opinion from truth. Critical thinking, on the other hand, is distinguishing facts and opinions or personal feelings. In making rational choices, first, we suspend beliefs and judgment until all facts have been gathered and considered. That is for critical thinking. More on distinguishing fact from opinions. Diba? Thinking critically. Suspending our own beliefs and judgment until all facts have been gathered and considered before determining what is fact and what is opinion. So both logic and critical thinking are tools in reasoning. Though facts are important, critical thinking also takes into consideration a cultural system, values, and beliefs. Critical thinking helps us uncover bias and prejudice and open to new ideas that necessarily in agreement with previous thought. Now, in reasoning, there are two basic types of reasoning: deductive and inductive. Inductive reasoning is based from observations in order to make generalizations. Inductive. So there are two types of reasoning. So to, deductive and inductive reasoning. See, inductive reasoning, it is based from observations in order to make generalization. So, in reasoning, diba, in inductive reasoning, you can come up with generalization based from observation. Observe before making generalization. And this reasoning is often applied in prediction, forecasting, and behavior. So, say inductive reasoning often applied in prediction, diba? Predicting what will happen, diba? So you can predict without observing the environment. So by observing, you can come up with generalization. That will be your prediction, diba? By observing the behavior, and then come up with generalization of what kind of person you are observing. That is inductive reasoning. Observing first in order to make generalizations. On the other hand, deductive reasoning draws, diba? So deductive reasoning draws conclusion from usually one broad judgment or definition and one more specific assertion, often an inference. So deductive reasoning. From the term deductive, it draws conclusion from usually one broad judgment or definition. Usually, si deductive reasoning, it draws conclusion from premises, diba? From broad judgment or premises, diba? Often an inference. Take for instance, this is an example of deductive reasoning. Okay. All philosophers are wise. That is the major premise. Confucius is a philosopher. That is the minor premise. By considering only two premises, you can come up with conclusion. That is deductive reasoning. It draws conclusion from one usually broad judgment or definition and one more assertion, often an inference. So therefore, Confucius is wise. Nakakama up siya aning conclusion by considering the two given premises or broad judgment, which is also considered or accepted as valid. All philosophers are wise, diba? Confucius is a philosopher, therefore Confucius is wise. Now, pag matuto ni inductive reasoning, sa inductive reasoning, mo-conclude siya nga si Confucius wise by observing the behavior of Confucius himself, di ba? By observing the behavior. Observe daan, di ba? There must be observation before coming up with conclusion that he is wise. Do you see the difference? Si inductive, based from observation in order to make generalization. Si deductive, it draws conclusion from usually one broad judgment or definition, like this. Okay, next, validity and soundness of an argument. This is an example of an argument, huh? It's an example of argument. When can you say, or when can we say that an argument is valid or sound? Diba? Based on the previous example or syllogism, this is an example of syllogism because for your information class, a syllogism, matawag din mo siya nga syllogism if the major premise is stated first, the minor premise is stated next, and then the conclusion is stated last. Matawag na siya nga syllogism. Based on the previous example or syllogism, if the two premises are constructed logically, then the conclusion must follow logically. And then the deductive argument is valid. What? Paunsa na to maingon nga the premises are constructed logically. Take note that the premises are constructed logically if it follows, or if the major premise is stated first, and then there is minor premise to support the assertion, and then before coming up with conclusion. So matawag din mo siya nga valid if the two premises are constructed logically. So there are two premises, and then before coming up with conclusion. Therefore, the argument, deductive argument mentioned above is considered valid. So valid siya basta nauna si major premise, then minor premise, and then conclusion. Or si conclusion based siya sa premises given. Matawag siya nga valid argument. Aside from valid, it is also sound. This does not necessarily mean that the conclusion is true or false, diba? So the validity of an argument is not about whether the conclusion is true or whether the conclusion is false. As long as it follows logically, diba? If the premises are constructed logically, then the conclusion must follow logically. It is already valid. Validity comes from, diba? Validity, take note class, validity comes from the logical conclusion based on logically constructed premises. As long as ang conclusion constructed based from logically constructed premises, then the argument is considered valid. Aside from valid, it's also considered as sound. Now, strength of an argument. When can you say that an argument is strong or not? On the other hand, inductive arguments cannot prove if the premises are true, diba? Inductive arguments cannot prove if the premises are true, which will also determine the truth of the conclusion. Inductive reasoning proves only probable support, diba? Because it's based on observation. Proves only probable support to the conclusion. An inductive argument that succeeds in providing such probable support is a strong argument. So the inductive argument, it proves only probable support to the conclusion, diba? It cannot prove if the premises are true, which will also determine the truth of the conclusion, but it only proves probable support to the conclusion. Once an inductive argument that succeeds in providing such probable support, then that argument is considered strong argument. While an inductive argument that fails to provide such support is weak, a strong argument with true premises is said to be cogent. Okay, I have an illustration about that. Okay. Try to look at the illustration. Diba? We have inductive and deductive arguments. So, if you notice kanina, ang atong gidetermine nga valid or invalid argument is only deductive argument. Si inductive, strong or weak argument. Take note, balik ta. Sa validity, Ang sa atong determine nga valid is only deductive argument. Matawag na to si deductive argument as valid if it is logically constructed, diba? If the premises are logically constructed and the conclusion is logically constructed based from the premises. Then the argument is valid. The deductive argument is valid. Now, talking with the strength of an argument, diba? Strength of an argument refers to inductive argument or inductive reasoning. We can say that an inductive argument is strong if it succeeds in providing such probable support to the conclusion. Diba? If the inductive reasoning proves only probable support to the conclusion. Okay, go back to our lecture. Determining the validity and soundness of an argument, atong lantawon is the deductive argument, di ba? Whereas the inductive argument, we will determine inductive argument whether strong or weak. Go back to our illustration. So, si deductive argument na iduha ka type of deductive argument, di ba? Valid or invalid. Valid or invalid. Si inductive argument or non-deductive argument na iduha ka types, strong and weak. Now, pag si deductive argument valid, the next ana is i-determine the validity of an argument does not mean, di ba? All valid deductive argument does not mean the premises are true, di ba? The premises are true. Pwede nga the premises are true and the premises are false, di ba? Ang valid deductive argument if valid argument, di ba? Ang valid argument if the premises are true, then that argument is considered good argument. Now, pag valid ang premises sa valid argument is false, then that argument is considered bad argument. Ato na punta ni invalid. Now, si invalid, pag invalid na argument, diretso nga bad argument na siya. Take note, si deductive argument nasa duha ka type, valid and invalid arguments. Now, pag may valid argument, it does not mean nga all premises are true. It can be also that the premises are false. Once the premises are true, that argument is considered good argument. If the premises are false, bad argument. Now, pag invalid argument, that is directly considered as bad argument. Ato na po sa pikas ni inductive reasoning. So, na-duha ka types of inductive reasoning, strong and weak. Now, inductive argument, if the argument is strong, it does not mean, di ba? Not all strong argument are having true premises or having false premises. Depende. Pwede nga that strong argument has true premises or has false premises. Now, if that strong argument has true premises, that is considered good argument or cogent. Take note. Si valid argument, if the premises are true, ang tawag na sound argument. Munang validity and sound, partner gina sila. Di ba? Once you determine that the argument is valid, di ba, the deductive argument is valid, and the premises are true, then that argument is considered sound. Now, ito ni inductive, once the argument is strong, and the premises are true, that is good argument, and that is called cogent. Di ba? Cogent. Balik. Nandiri. An inductive argument that succeeds in providing probable support is a strong argument, while an inductive argument that fails to provide such support is weak. A strong argument with true premises is said to be cogent. So, sakto ang illustration, di ba? A strong argument with true premises are said to be cogent. Take note, a cogent is a strong argument with true premises. And then, pag weak ang argument, automatically nga, it is considered as bad argument. Strong argument siya, pero false premises, and then automatic nga bad argument. Another simple illustration. There are two types of argument, deductive and inductive. Diba? Si deductive, valid. So, si valid ay duha ka types na sound or unsound. Sound argument if the premises are true, unsound argument if the premises are false. Invalid, automatically nga sound argument. Now, si inductive, strong can be cogent or uncogent. Cogent if the premises are true. Now, for example, do you think Congressman Jerry will be re-elected? Ina, I doubt it. His district has become more conservative in recent years. Also, 63% of the registered voters in his district are in the opposition. This argument is both statistical argument and predictive argument, which are two common patterns of inductive reasoning. Also, the conclusion does not follow necessarily from the premises. Okay, concepts in logic. Concepts in logic. Argument, proposition, premise, conclusion, and syllogism. Argument is a statement of series of series of statements for or against something. When we say argument, it is a statement or series of statements for something or against something. That is argument. Premise. When we say premise, it is a statement or idea that is accepted as being true and that is used as basis of an argument. So premise, idea that is accepted as being true and it serves as basis of an argument in coming up with conclusion. Like for example, this is the premises, diba? All philosophers are wise, major premise. It is also considered as true, diba? True that is used as basis in coming up with argument and then conclusion. Proposition. Proposition is something that is presented to a person or group of people to consider. A statement that is asserted or denied, either true or false. Proposition is either true or false. Conclusion. Conclusion is a generalization out from observation or based on premises, di ba? Pag ang conclusion based from general observation, that is inductive reasoning. Pag ang conclusion based on premises, that is deductive reasoning. Conclusion is generalization out from observation or based on premises. There are four types of statements. We have declarative, it states facts, diba? It ends with period. Interrogative, it states questions or in interrogative form, question form. It ends with question mark. Imperative, it shows command, diba? It ends with period. Exclamatory, it talks about expressions. It ends with exclamation points. Example: all men are liars. That is declarative. Pedro is a man. Declarative. Therefore, Pedro is a liar. That is declarative. There are two technical terms of an argument: conclusion and a premise, diba? Try to look at the example. So there are two technical terms of an argument: the premise and the conclusion. These are the premise and followed by the conclusion. Indicators of conclusion are the following: therefore, thus, hence, ergo. Diba? With the word therefore, thus, hence, ergo, and many more. So that means that is a concluding statement. Premise, indicators, because, since, but, etc. Premise. Okay, there are types of argument: deductive argument, inductive argument. Deductive argument if it comes up with conclusion out from premises. Inductive argument, it come up with conclusion based from observation. Valid argument, it is a deductive argument with true premises. No, valid argument, it is an argument, a deductive argument that follows logical construction of premises and conclusion. Invalid argument is the opposite, diba? The opposite of valid argument. It does not follow logical construction of premises and conclusion. Sound argument, we can say that the argument is sound if it is valid at the same time it composed of true premises. And sound argument is the opposite. So this is the illustration that I showed to you a while ago. So there are two types of argument: deductive and non-deductive or inductive. So deductive, valid or invalid. Valid, it can be valid can be true, having true premises or false premises. If true premises, then that is good argument, and that is called sound. I already explained it kanina. Next, categorical proposition. Take note that proposition is something that is exerted or denied, something that is true or false. It is a classical or Aristotelian study of education focused on argument containing only propositions of special kind. There are four elements of categorical proposition: the subject term, the predicate term, copula, and the quantifier. When you say the subject term, it is the term. When you say categorical proposition, by the way, this is an example of a proposition. Diba? Proposition is siya. Itawag siya categorical proposition because it has the four elements of categorical proposition. Then the four elements of categorical proposition are subject term, the predicate term, copula, and then quantifier. When I say subject term, it is the term or group of terms spoken of, being talked about, the one which is affirmed or denied. It is a noun or noun substitute. For example, the proposition, all politicians are liars. The subject term is politicians, meaning the one being talked are the politicians, diba? Or is the politicians, diba? Being talked about is the politicians. That is the subject term. The predicate term is the action that affirms or denies the subject. It is a noun or a noun substitute. The predicate of the proposition is liars, diba? Liars. And that is the predicate term. Copula is a form of verb to be, to connect the subject and the predicate term. The subject term is politicians, the predicate term is liars, and then the copula is are. The copula is a form of verb to be, and that is are. Diba? That connects the subject and predicate terms, so copula. And then the quantifier are all, no, and some. Diba? Quantifier, the term all. Example, all for universal, all and no for universal propositions, and some for particular propositions. Okay, classifications of propositions. So we have two classifications of propositions. We have classification as to quantity and classification as to quality. When you say quantity, it refers to the numbers of referents to which the subject term is applied. It is either universal or particular. It is either universal or particular. Universal propositions are A and E propositions. Propositions that started with all and no, diba, propositions. Particular are I and O propositions. Diba, propositions that started with some. Examples: all flowers are fragrant. With the presence of all, this is universal. Take note, as a quantity, this is universal. Some politicians are corrupt. Diba? Some. Diba? This is an I proposition. That is, as to quantity, particular. Okay, quality. There are two um, types of propositions as to quality. It refers to the state of being, or it answers the question what kind of proposition. It can be affirmative or negative. Take note, affirmative, it has no negation or words that negate something, di ba? Like for example, Filipino workers are the best in the world. That is affirmative. Positive, di ba, ang sentence. Affirmative siya as to quality. Now, when you say Filipino politicians are not the right models for the young, with the presence of not, diba, and no, that makes it negative. Okay, categorical proposition as to qualities, we have affirmative, A and I, negative, E and O, because E proposition started with no, and O has has the word not that makes them negative. Quantities, universal, A and E, uh, propositions that started with all and no, di ba? Particular, propositions that started with some, I and O. Another explanation when they say universal, gitawag siya universal proposition because uh, uh, all that refers to tanan, di ba? Universal. No meaning still tanan gihapon nga wala. Mo nang universal. Say particular proposition dili tanan. Dili tanan, that is some lang, uban. Nasabtan. Ang pananglitan, all flowers, meaning tanan nga bulak are fragrant. That is universal as to referent, number of referent. Some politicians, meaning dili tanan nga politicians, pero only some. That is particular. Nasabtan. I hope you have um, um, na-gets ninyo ang akong buot pasabot. Okay, symbols of proposition. Kanina I made mention A, E, I proposition, A, I, O proposition. When I say A proposition, di ba? Universal affirmative. Meaning, universal affirmative. All professors are professionals. Meaning, tanan, universal application, all professors are professionals. And the quality is affirmative. Walay no or walay not nga word, di ba? The sense of the proposition is positive or affirmative. E proposition, universal negative. All saints are not sinners. That is universal negative. Also, when they put no saints are sinners. That is still universal negative. I proposition or particular affirmative, some politicians are ugly. Although maot paminawon si ugly, but the the quality of the sentence is still affirmative, 'di ba? Without the presence of not and no word, 'di ba? Negation word, negating word. All proposition, particular negative, some good men are not hard to find. With the presence of not, it makes it negative, and particular because it only refers to some. Okay, schematical forms. All S is P. That is a proposition. That is, this is a quantifier, this is subject term, this is the copula, and then the predicate term. All S is P. That is the A proposition. No S is P. This is E proposition. Negative, diba? Universal negative. No S is P or E proposition or universal negative. Some S is P. This is I proposition or particular affirmative proposition. Some S is not P, O proposition or particular negative proposition. Okay. Paunsa ta naka-come up og A, E, I, O. Hanap to siya gikan. So the Latin term origin. So the Latin term origin affirmative. So gikan siya sa term nga affirmo, meaning A and I. So gikuha si A and I, affirmative. I affirm. Si negative pod, si negative, si E og O proposition, gikan siya sa Latin term nga nego, meaning I deny. Okay, distribution of proposition. Please take note of the distribution table because this also useful in determining whether the argument is valid or not, um, by knowing its whether if the subject or its the predicate is distributed or not. Okay, let's start with a proposition. Si a proposition dara iyang subject is distributed, iyang predicate is undistributed. Si a proposition, iyang subject is distributed, iyang predicate is distributed. Again, balik tani a proposition, iyang subject is distributed and then the predicate is undistributed. Si a proposition, iyang subject is distributed, iyang predicate is distributed. Si I proposition, iyang subject is undistributed sa ubos and then the predicate is undistributed. O proposition, the subject is undistributed and the predicate is distributed. I have also a simple tabular table for that. A proposition, all SSP, the schematical form, universal, affirmative, diba? The quantity is universal, quality is affirmative. In short, this is a universal affirmative proposition. This is the subject is distributed and the predicate is undistributed. A proposition, no SSP, universal, negative, distributed ang subject, distributed ang predicate. Okay, I proposition, some SSP, particular affirmative, subject is undistributed, predicate is undistributed. And all proposition, some S is not P, particular negative, subject is undistributed, and the predicate is distributed. Next is categorical syllogism. Categorical syllogism is a logical scheme of a formal argument consisting of a major premise and a minor premise and a conclusion which must be logically true if the premises are true. Categorical syllogism. So a logical scheme, logical construction of formal argument consisting of, matawag din mo siya nga categorical syllogism if the argument is consist of major premise, minor premise, and a conclusion. Pag naaning tulo, that is all categorical syllogism. Aside from that, there are three defining characteristics of syllogism. It is when the major premise is stated first, diba? It is the minor premise is stated next or second, and then the conclusion is stated last. So this is a categorical syllogism. We assume, diba? This is an example of categorical syllogism. The first is the major premise, the minor premise, and the conclusion. Paunsa man ito ma-determine nga kana siya major premise, kana siya minor premise, kani siya conclusion. Take note of the definition of major premise. The major premise contains the major term. So the major premise contains the major term with the symbol P. Diba? The major premise contains the major term which is the predicate of the conclusion. Ano tani conclusion? This is the subject. This is the predicate. Okay. Take note that the major term premise contains the major term which is the predicate of the conclusion. The predicate is courageous men, asa sa courageous men dara. So, since naadiri si major term, this is the major premise. Sabtan. Next, minor premise. It contains the minor term with the symbol of S. Okay, mga tana, mga anong P ang symbol sa major term because it is the predicate of the conclusion. Mga tana mo anong S ang minor term because it is the subject of the conclusion. The minor premise contains the minor term which is the subject of the conclusion. Asa si minor term? Soldiers. And dara si soldiers, diba? The subject of conclusion, therefore this is the minor premise. Now, the middle term does not exist in the conclusion. Well, dili ito makita sa conclusion, appearing instead in both premises. So, dili ito makita sa conclusion, pero nasa pareho nga premises. Scouts is the middle term, the symbol of M. Okay. Gets? Matawag niyo siya nga major premise because naa siya ang major term nga predicate sa conclusion. This is minor premise because nasa yang minor term is the subject of conclusion. This is the middle term, wala sa conclusion but naa sa both premises. Example. Una akong example kanina, major premise siya. This is the middle term, this is the major term, the minor term, and then the middle term. So the middle term is scouts, the major term is the predicate of the conclusion, courageous men, the minor term is soldiers. Okay, mood of syllogism. Okay, mood of syllogism, example, AEI, AEA, AEO. These are all syllogism, meaning, paunsa na to ma-determine ang mood sa syllogism. Try to look at what type of proposition is being used. Okay, using the symbol, diba? All scouts are courageous men, diba? All SSP. Therefore, this is universal affirmative proposition or A proposition. A na siya, A. And then ikaduha, some soldiers. The some, meaning particular siya. And then affirmative. Particular, affirmative. So this is I proposition. And then the conclusion is some, not. This is O proposition. Therefore, A, I, O. The mood is A, I, O. There are 64 moods of syllogism, like AAA, AAE, AAI, AAO, AAA, AAI. So there are 64 moods of syllogism. So A, I, O. Therefore, the mood of syllogism is A, I, O. Okay, figure of syllogism. Take note that there are 4 figures of syllogism. The first figure is M, the middle term, and then the predicate term MP, SM, therefore SP. The second figure is PM, SM, SP. Third is MP, MS, SP. Figure 4, PM, MS, SP. The form of syllogism, the form is mood plus, this is the formula, mood plus figure of syllogism is the form of syllogism. Take for example, all scouts are courageous men. This is A proposition, right? Universal affirmative. M is the middle term with the symbol of P, and courageous men is the major term which is the symbol of P, MP. Second proposition in the syllogism is I proposition, particular affirmative proposition. S is soldiers. The soldiers is S for the minor term. Scouts is for middle term. So SMI proposition. The conclusion is O proposition. Some soldiers is S and the P. Diba? O proposition. Therefore, the mood is AIO. Figure is MPSMSP. Ano to makita? MPSMSP. Therefore, this is figure 1. The form is AIO1. Next is 6 rules in testing the validity of syllogism. So there are 6 rules in testing the validity of syllogism. When can you say that the syllogism is valid or not? Rule number 1. The syllogism must contain exactly 3 terms, exactly of which must be used in the same sense throughout the argument. Violation of this rule is called fallacy of 4 terms. That is the first rule. Violation of this rule is called fallacy of 4 terms. You can say that a certain syllogism is valid if it does not violate rule number 1. And rule number 1 states that the syllogism must contain exactly 3 terms. What are the 3 terms? The middle term, the predicate term, and the minor term. Once it violates this rule, the violation is called fallacy of 4 terms. Okay, try to look at the example. All laws, diba? Laws are laws enacted by legislative bodies. All laws of physics are laws. All laws of physics are laws of, so daghan kay siya. I mean, the term laws are being used in all throughout the syllogism. So it violates rule number 1. The violation is called fallacy of 4 terms. Okay, rule number 2. We can say that a certain syllogism is valid if it does not violate rule number 2. Once it violates rule number 2, then the syllogism is invalid, diba? And the violation of this rule is called fallacy of undistributed middle. Take note, violation of rule number 2 is called fallacy of undistributed middle. Okay, try to like the rule number 2 is all about the middle term. So si rule number 2 particular siya ni middle term. The middle term must be distributed in at least one premise. So at least one premise lang. Lantaw na to si middle term. Okay, si middle term dara, 'di ba? Predicate of a proposition, 'di ba? A proposition. Lantaw na to ha. Dapat distributed siya in at least one premise. Now, this is the middle term, which is the predicate of a proposition. Lantaw na to. Predicate of a proposition. A proposition. The predicate is undistributed. Okay, napa isa. All dogs are creatures. Still a proposition. Meaning, si middle term is, di ba? The predicate of a proposition is undistributed. It violates rule number 2. The middle term must be distributed in at least one premise. Okay ra nga dili siya distributed sa major. Any of the kuan is sa isa, di ba? In any sa major premise ba ka or sa minor premise, as long as distributed siya sa isa. But both are undistributed. Therefore, it violates rule number 2, fallacy of undistributed middle. So the mood is AAA, figure 2, AAA2. The violation is invalid, fallacy of undistributed middle. Number 3, rule number 3. A term that is distributed in the conclusion must be distributed in the premise. A term that is distributed in the conclusion must be distributed in the premise. Violation of this rule is called fallacy of illicit minor, once a term is nasa minor premise, and fallacy of illicit major, basta a term is nasa major premise. Okay. Sabto na to. Analyze the example for illicit process of the major. All flowers are fragrant. Trees are not flowers. Therefore, no trees are fragrant. The term fragrant is the major premise, diba? Term distributed in the conclusion must be distributed in the premise. The term fragrant is the major premise, is particular because it is predicate of an affirmative proposition, diba? That becomes universal in the conclusion since it is a predicate of a negative proposition. This leads us to commit the fallacy of illicit major, a violation of which says that major premise cannot be raised to universal fit is only a particular in the premise. Okay, sabto na to. I have a simple way to understand this rule, whether it is valid or not. Take note that the rule states that a term that is distributed in the conclusion must be distributed in the premise. Now, this is E proposition, right? This is E proposition. Okay, this is E proposition. Adto ta ni E proposition. Take note that E proposition, both subject and predicate is distributed. Therefore, dapat, diba, in order to make it valid, dapat distributed ang both subject and predicate sa premises. Okay, lantaw na to si trees. Dara si trees. This is the subject of trees are not flowers. Unsa na siya nga proposition? Um, this is a proposition. Okay, distributed siya. Diba? Distributed. Pareho sila, distributed. Now, fragrant. Fragrant is the predicate of a proposition. Now, kung lantaw na to ni si ang predicate sa a proposition, di ba? Ang predicate sa a proposition, pareha ani nga case is undistributed. Di ba? A proposition, the predicate is undistributed. And the rule states that a term that is distributed in the conclusion must be distributed in the premise. So, trees, the subject of a proposition, distributed siya. Distributed siya, wala problema. Pero pag abot sa isa, fragrant, meaning dadari, diba, fragrant, distributed siya sa conclusion, pag abot sa premise, undistributed. This violates rule number 3, therefore, fallacy of illicit major. Anong illicit major siya? Because this is a major term, or nasa sa major premise. Okay, analyze the next example for the illicit process of the minor. Dili na to sabton, dili sa unan to. Okay, this is a proposition. In a proposition, both subject and predicate are distributed. So philosophers, predicate of a proposition, diba? And a proposition and predicate is undistributed. Therefore, fallacy, illicit process of the minor. It violates rule number 3. Okay, rule number 4. Fallacy of exclusive premise. The premises cannot be both negative. Simple ra kayo si rule number 4. The premises cannot be both negative. Basta negative ang both premises, it violates rule number 4, fallacy of exclusive premise. Example, no monkeys, negative. Some human beings are not gentlemen, negative. Then it violates rule number 4. Violation is called fallacy of exclusive premise. Rule number 5. One negative premise is allowed if and only if the conclusion is negative. Violation of this rule is called fallacy of drawing an affirmative conclusion from negative premise or fallacy of drawing a negative conclusion from affirmative premise. So, vice versa ni siya. Pag naing one negative premise, okay ra. Basta ang conclusion, negative. Okay. No robots are conscious beings. So, negative. Diba? Ang premise, lang tao na to. The conclusion is affirmative. It violates rule number 5. The violation is fallacy of drawing an affirmative conclusion from a negative premise. Now, ipag-ibutang nato nga both affirmative ang premises, then manahimong negative ang conclusion, it still violates rule number 5. Diba? That is fallacy of drawing negative conclusion from affirmative premises. Take note that one negative premise is allowed if and only if the conclusion is negative. The conclusion must be negative if there is one negative premise is allowed. There is one negative premise. Rule number 5. Last rule, diba? Rule number 6. If both premises are universal, the conclusion must also be universal. Violation of this fallacy is called existential fallacy. So, nato na to. All universal. Diba? Universal affirmative. No. Universal negative. Therefore, some. Diba? Some is particular. Therefore, it violates rule number 6, existential fallacy. Next topic will be informal fallacies. Please watch out for my next video lecture for informal fallacies.